The day Vera Kowalczyk walked into the Millhaven Community Center with 43 mason jars of raw wildflower honey balanced in 2 wooden crates and set them on the folding table at the front of the room, the air was so thick with summer heat that the ceiling fan overhead merely stirred the misery from one corner to the other. Every chair was filled. Farmers with cracked boots and sunburned necks sat beside their wives. The feed store owner had closed early. Even the pharmacist had locked his door and driven out from town. They were all there because the aquifer had dropped another 8 feet since May, because the municipal water district had announced emergency rationing, and because Harlan Foss, Regional Director of Agricorps Land and Water Services, was about to explain to them in the measured tones of a man delivering a kindness exactly how much they would each receive for the sale of their water rights. Vera set her crates on the table and stood beside them without sitting down, without speaking, and looked out at all those faces. Some of them looked back at her with shame, some with raw and open need. A few, she noticed, could not look at her at all. The air in the room held a hush that was almost physical, like the moment before a thunderclap when every small creature in the field goes still and listens. Harlan Foss sat at the far end of the table, with his hands folded over a leather portfolio, and watched her the way a man watches a card he did not expect to see turned over. He had made Vera 3 offers in the past 7 months. She had declined each one in a single quiet sentence, and each time he had smiled and said the offer would not improve with waiting, and he had been wrong every single time. The real question hanging over that sweltering room, the question that every person in every chair already knew in their bones even if they had not said it aloud, was not whether Vera Kowalczyk would sell. The real question was what she would choose to do with what she had. And that question, it ought to be said at the outset, had been settled long before that afternoon. It had been settled by the land itself, and by an old woman named Brigida Szczepanik, who kept a half-acre of linden trees at the edge of her property and spoke to bees as though they were slow-witted relatives who needed patient instruction. It had been settled by a boy named Marcus Ola, who was 11 years old and missing 2 front teeth, and who had named every hive on Vera's property, and could tell you on any given morning which colonies were restless and which were calm. And it had been settled, in the largest sense, by Vera's father, Tadeusz Kowalczyk, who had deeded the back 40 acres of the family's original homestead parcel into his daughter's name 11 years ago, when she was 22 and newly married to a man he did not trust, and who had done it quietly through a county records office 40 miles away, and told no one. But that is where the story ends. The story begins 7 months before, in November, when Vera arrived. She came in a truck that needed a new serpentine belt, pulling a small trailer with $420 in a checking account and $11,000 in cashier's checks tucked into the inside pocket of her jacket. The $11,000 was the whole of what the divorce settlement had left her after Raymond's attorney had finished working through the marital assets with a thoroughness that Vera had found almost impressive in its brutality. Raymond had contested the savings. He had contested the household furnishings. He had contested a mutual fund her grandmother had opened in her name before she was born, arguing that appreciation during the marriage constituted a shared asset, and the judge had agreed with him on enough of it that Vera had walked out of that courtroom with less than she walked in with when she married him 6 years prior. What Raymond's attorney had not contested, because Raymond's attorney had not known to contest it, because Raymond himself had not known it existed, was the back 40. Tadeusz Kowalczyk had died 2 years earlier, and the deed had passed to Vera without fanfare. A county assessor's notice forwarded to her old address, quietly rerouted to her sister's house, quietly held there, quietly waiting. The back 40 sat behind the old homestead farmhouse, which the rest of the Kowalczyk estate had sold to a neighboring operation years ago. The back 40 was landlocked from the road, accessible only by an easement across the sold parcel, and had been assessed at a tax value of roughly $8,000 on account of its being, according to the county parcel map, marginal bottomland, with a seasonal creek and an overgrowth of cottonwood and box elder, and an old root cellar in such advanced disrepair that the structure itself was listed as a liability. Nobody had looked at it closely in a decade. It had not occurred to anyone that it was worth looking at closely. It was weeds and soft ground and old trees, and the only thing it had produced in living memory was a bumper crop of wild bergamot and clover and basswood bloom that attracted a quantity of insects that nobody had ever thought to exploit. Vera had spent one afternoon walking the 40 before the divorce was final. She had not told Raymond she was going. She had not told anyone. She drove out on a Sunday in October, walked the perimeter in her mother's old barn boots, stood in the middle of the bottomland with the cottonwood leaves coming down around her in loose gold spirals, listened to the sound the place made, and decided what she was going to do. The arithmetic of the thing was this: $11,000 and 40 acres. Every dollar she spent before the land produced something was a dollar removed from a sum that did not grow unless she grew it. She kept that equation in her head the way a person keeps a recurring low-grade pain, not to suffer it, but to remember it was there, to stay honest about the margin between surviving and not. The farmhouse on the homestead property had been converted to a rental unit by the operation that bought it, and the tenant had moved out the previous spring. Vera negotiated with the farm's new owners, the Grunewald family, a 3-month occupancy of the farmhouse in exchange for caretaking and minor repairs, which gave her shelter and bought her time to make the root cellar on the back 40 habitable, enough to use as a storage shed and a working space. She put up 42 hive boxes in the first 2 weeks of November, working alone from before dawn to after dark, her breath showing in the cold air, her hands stiffening on the wood and wire. She sourced her nucleus colonies from a commercial beekeeper in the next county who was liquidating a portion of his operation, and she paid $380 for 12 nucleus colonies, which left her with $40 in the checking account and 11 cashier's checks she had not yet cashed. The hives went into the bottomland in a long east-facing curve along the tree line, positioned to catch the morning light and sheltered from the north wind by the ridge of box elder. She did not know at that point whether they would survive the winter. She knew the forage would be exceptional in spring if they did. The basswood trees alone, she had read, could sustain a colony through a full nectar flow with almost no supplemental forage required. Whether the land would give what it appeared to promise was a question only time and the bees themselves could answer, and Vera understood with a clarity that was not entirely comfortable that she was betting the arithmetic of her survival on insects that might die before March. On the day she set the last hive, a Saturday, cold and gray with low cloud, she stood at the end of the row, and one of the nucleus colonies, a small winter cluster she could hear buzzing faintly inside the box, sent out a single forager through the entrance notch. The bee circled once in the cold air, found no bloom worth pursuing, and returned. It was a small thing. It was nearly nothing. Vera watched it and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted there since October, since longer than October. She went back to the farmhouse and ate a can of soup and slept for 9 hours and woke up resolved. In early December, she drove into Millhaven for feed and wire staples, and a man outside the hardware store asked her what she was keeping out on the Kowalczyk parcel. She told him. He looked at her for a moment as a person looks at an object placed in an unexpected location, trying to determine whether it is lost or deliberately placed. Then he said, You know, Connie Pruitt tried bees about 6 years back and lost every last hive to varroa, and the whole thing was a dead loss." And she nodded and said she had heard that. And he said, "Well, it is your money, I suppose." And she said, "Yes, it is," and went in for her staples. She heard it again at the post office, and once more at the cafe where she stopped for coffee. The versions were consistent. The consensus was that bees were a fool's venture on bottomland nobody had managed to make pay in 30 years, that she was alone and inexperienced, and that whatever money she had put into those boxes was as good as forfeit. She noted that nobody in town knew how much money she had put in, which meant they were guessing at a figure substantial enough to justify their pity, and she found something quietly useful in that. Let them assume the number was larger than it was. Their assumption of her foolishness was a kind of privacy she had not expected and did not intend to squander. She drove home in the late afternoon, the flat winter light lying across the fields in long, pale strips, and she ran the arithmetic again in her head, not because she did not know it, but because the habit of it was steadying, the way some people recite prayers, not for the content, but for the rhythm. It was a week before Christmas when Brigida Stepanek came. She came across the field in her rubber boots and her wool coat and her knit hat with the tassel that had lost its body and hung as a sad thread, carrying a jar of something she set on the doorstep without ceremony. Vera opened the door to find her standing there, a woman of perhaps 80, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent composed expression, as though she had passed through every weather imaginable and arrived at the agreement that weather was weather, and there was no profit in registering surprise at it. Brigida had come over from Poland in 1962 with a husband and 2 children, and a cutting of linden from her mother's garden, and the linden had grown into 3 trees at the corner of her property, and the husband had died, and the children had moved to the cities, and Brigida remained, tending her trees, putting up preserves, keeping, as it turned out, 2 hives of her own in a style that owed more to custom than to any manual Vera had ever read. She came in and sat down and accepted tea and looked at Vera across the table with an appraising steadiness and said, "I watched you put those boxes in along the edge." Vera said she hoped it was all right, using the easement as much as she had been. Brigida waved this away. She said, "You put them with the morning sun." "Yes." "You put the entrance away from the north." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Vera copied down in a small notebook she kept on the kitchen counter and kept there for the rest of that year. Brigida said, "The hive does not make honey for you. It makes honey because it is the nature of the hive. Your work is not to make it do this. Your work is only to not prevent it. If you stop trying to run the bee and start trying to read the bee will tell you everything the flower already told it, and the flower has been reading this ground for longer than either of your grandmothers has been alive." Vera wrote it down and asked her what was in the jar. Brigida said it was lime blossom salve from her own linden, and it was for the cracks in Vera's hands, which were, she said, a disgrace. She came back the following week and the week after that, always with something, a jar or a cutting or a piece of advice delivered with the same unhurried assurance. And she never once suggested that the hives were a poor idea or that the land was marginal or that Vera was in over her head, which in Millhaven in that December was the minority position. Marcus Ole appeared in January on a Saturday, materializing at the edge of the tree line with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath clouding around his face, watching Vera conduct a midwinter inspection of the hive entrances. She asked him what he was doing. He said he was seeing. She said, "Seeing what?" He said, "The bees." She told him there was not much to see in January. The bees were clustered and keeping warm, and he said he knew that. He just wanted to see where they were. She asked him whose boy he was, and he said his mother was Darla Ola, who ran the laundry on Clement Street, and that his father was not currently around. She let him stay. He was back the following Saturday and the one after that, and by February he had appointed himself her assistant inspector, a role she had not advertised and could not have done without. He had a stillness around the hives that Brigida confirmed was the correct kind, the kind bees read as non-threatening, the kind that cannot be faked or learned quickly, and that some people never manage at all. He named the colonies in the first week of February, standing at each hive in turn with the same solemnity a person brings to a matter of some importance. The naming was his own system, based on properties he observed or intuited: steady, watchful, the burning kind, cold patience, morning first. The Patriarch colony, the largest and calmest cluster in the row, the one that had sent out the forager on that first cold Saturday in November, he named Deliberate. Vera asked him why. He said, because it does not do anything fast, but it also does not stop. She thought about that for a while and decided he was right, and that Deliberate was a good name for a colony and possibly for a method. Spring arrived and the basswood bloomed late but hard, a 2-week flow that Vera had read about in the county's historical agricultural survey but had not dared rely on. The hives came through winter with 37 of the 42 boxes surviving, a loss rate of 12%, which her reading told her was at the lower end of the acceptable range and well below what a beginner might expect. The surviving colonies built fast on the basswood and the wild bergamot and the clover that grew in the damp bottomland margins, and by late June, Vera had extracted her first meaningful harvest, working the extractor in the root cellar through the night, with Marcus sitting on an overturned crate and handing her uncapping tools and asking questions about centrifugal force. The honey was pale gold, almost luminous, with a flavor that was floral and complex in a way Vera could not fully describe but recognized as unusual. She filled 81 jars from that first extraction and tasted each variety and arranged them by color in the root cellar and stood back and looked at them and ran the arithmetic, and for the first time the number on the right side of the equation was larger than the number on the left. She did not celebrate this loudly. She noted it the way you note a change in the weather, carefully and without drama, because the weather can always change back. She told Brigida, who came and tasted from a spoon, and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "This is what the linden has been making here for 40 years, and no one bothered to collect it. That is the joke the land has been keeping to itself." Vera wrote that down, too. It was a buyer from a specialty provisions market in a city 3 hours north who first named a price that made Vera set down her pen. He had come through the county buying local producers for a late summer catalog, had stopped at a farm stand where Vera had placed a dozen test jars on consignment, had tasted the basswood variety, and had driven out to the back 40 without calling ahead. He was a compact, serious-faced man named Stellan Burr, who carried a small notebook and tasted things the way a careful reader reads difficult sentences, slowly and more than once. He offered her $11 a jar for the full 81-jar inventory and said he would put her in his fall catalog, and could she produce 4 times that volume by the following summer. Vera looked at him across the root cellar table and did the arithmetic visibly in her head, in a way he could see. She said she could produce twice that volume with confidence and 4 times that volume with work, and he said that was honest, and he would take the confidence number as the contract and pay a 20% premium for any overage she delivered, and she said that was agreeable, and shook his hand, and he paid her $891 in cash and took every jar she had. She watched him drive out on the easement road across the Grunewald parcel and felt the weight of what had just happened settle into the arithmetic like a foundation stone settling into firm ground. The number on the right side was now substantially larger than the number on the left. She went and told Brigida. Brigida nodded and said, "Now you bank it like a coal under ash. You keep it low. The low coal is the one that is still burning in the morning." Vera wrote that down. She had been keeping the size of her harvest to herself as a matter of instinct, not as a strategy she had designed so much as a habit she had maintained because nobody in town had seemed particularly interested in accurate information about her operation, and she had not seen a reason to correct their assumptions. Harlan Foss, however, had been paying attention in ways she had not fully appreciated. He arrived for the first time in August in a company truck with the AgriCorps logo on the door panel, and the air conditioning running even on the short drive from the road, and he knocked on the farmhouse door and introduced himself with the warmth of a man who is certain of his welcome. He was perhaps 55, well-barbered, in a pressed shirt the color of a prairie sky, and he had the specific quality of a person who has made his living being underestimated by the people he was dealing with, which meant that Vera, who had some experience of this quality in others, recognized it immediately and said almost nothing in response to his first 10 minutes of conversation. He said he was in the area talking to landowners about AgriCorps' Watershed Partnership Initiative, which was a program designed to support rural communities through consolidated water resource management, and that he wanted to make sure she was aware of her options, given that the parcel she was operating on included, he understood, a seasonal creek with a documented subsurface connection to the regional aquifer. She said she was aware of the creek. He said AgriCorps was prepared to offer her a fair market value assessment of the parcel's water resource rights, and that she might be surprised by what they came out to. She said she was not currently looking to sell any part of the parcel. He smiled and said the offer would not improve with waiting. She said in that case she would let it wait, and he went back to his truck and drove away, and she watched him go, and then went to look up subsurface water rights in the county assessor's database, and what she found there was something she kept very low, very quiet, like a coal under ash. What she had found was this: a hydrological survey conducted by the county in the previous decade, available as a public record, had identified the seasonal creek bed on the back 40 as the primary surface expression of a perched aquifer lens that sat approximately 60 feet below the bottomland surface, separate from the regional aquifer that every other farm in the valley drew from, fed by a different drainage basin, and consequently not subject to the same depletion curve. The county had flagged it as a potential supplemental water source for the district, and had then, as county offices do, filed the survey and forgotten about it for 10 years. Vera read the survey 3 times. She sent a copy to a water rights attorney in the county seat who confirmed that because the parcel was in her name alone, predating the marriage, the water rights attached to it were solely hers, unencumbered, not contested in the divorce settlement, and not subject to AgriCorps' watershed consolidation efforts without her voluntary agreement. The attorney's bill was $240. She paid it the same afternoon and went home and walked the creek bed in the fading light, the cottonwood whispering over her head, and she thought about what Brigida had said about the flower reading the ground for longer than either of their grandmothers had been alive. The basswood and the bergamot and the clover grew in that bottomland because of the moisture that percolated up from below, slow and consistent and underground, invisible to anyone who was not paying the right kind of attention. The bees had known, they had been reading it all along. She had only followed them to the source. The summer dried into August, and August hardened into September, and the rains that should have come did not come. And by October, every farmer in the valley who ran on the regional aquifer was watching his pump output numbers with the expression of a person watching a wound bleed. The municipal water district announced a second round of emergency rationing. The Grunewald operation ran their center pivot irrigators at half pressure and prayed. 3 smaller operations to the south had already sold their water rights to AgriCorps in the first round of offers in July, which had given Harlan Foss enough consolidated volume to manage his own operation through the season with enough surplus to make him the most powerful single water stakeholder in the valley. He had visited Vera a second time in September, less warm than the first visit, and a third time in early October, not warm at all, and had left after the third visit, having implied, without saying it plainly, that the county had certain interests in the creek's subsurface connection to the regional aquifer that might require an access review, which Vera's attorney, when she reported this, described as a bluff, and confirmed that the hydrological separation was sufficient to make any such review conclude in her favor, provided she had good documentation, which she did. The implied threat was designed to make her sell in a moment of doubt. She had noted it and declined to feel it. Harlan Foss had also, at that third visit, made a remark about the honey operation's first-year extraction that was specific enough, 74 jars, to make clear that he had a source of information closer to her operation than any honest person would have had. The number was wrong by 7 jars, which told her he had the information secondhand and slightly degraded, and that his source was either Marcus's mother Darla, who sometimes talked to the pharmacist, or the Grunewald boy, who had once helped carry crates, and who was 17 and liked to seem important. She noted it, wrote down the wrong figure he had given, and kept it. A banker keeps receipts. A coal under ash does not announce itself. It was Gil Pruitt who came to her first among the farmers, and the fact that it was Gil was its own kind of accounting. Gil Pruitt was the son of the Connie Pruitt who had lost her bees to Varroa 6 years back, and he had been at the hardware store the previous December when the man outside had told Vera that it was her money to waste, and he had laughed at that, a short, sharp laugh that he had not bothered to conceal, and Vera had heard it and had not said anything about it then or since. Gil came in early October on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands in the literal, and not merely the figurative sense, and he was thinner than he had been in December, and his boots were the same cracked pair, and his neck was burned as dark as the October earth. He stood at the edge of the property line for a while before he came up to the door, which Marcus, who was keeping the Saturday inspection schedule through the fall, reported to Vera with the matter-of-fact precision of a child who observes everything. Gil told her that his creek-fed stock pond had gone to 18 inches of mud, and that he had 63 head of cattle going into winter and no reliable water source, and that he knew she had the perched aquifer, and he was asking, he said, not expecting, just asking, whether there was any arrangement possible. He said he did not have much to offer except labor, and that he knew that might not be worth much to her. Vera looked at him for a moment with the steadiness she had developed over a year of looking at things that required seeing clearly. She said, "I have fence line on the north quarter that needs new cedar posts, 200 linear feet, and the root cellar roof needs new decking, and if you want to bring your cattle to the creek pasture through January, that labor is the price, and there is no other price." He looked at her as a man looks at a sentence he has to read twice to make sure he understood it correctly. He said, "You mean, that is all?" She said, "That was all." He put his hat back on his head and said he would be there in the morning, and he was. The word moved in the way that words move in a community under pressure, which is to say quickly and without loss of detail. By the third week of October, there were 2 other operations asking about the creek pasture, and Vera had given them the same answer, which was that the price was labor, and there was no other price. Harlan Foss came a 4th time. This time he sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he did not bother with the warmth he had brought to the first visit, and he made an offer that was 4 times his first offer, which suggested to Vera that her water rights attorney's assessment of the parcel's value had been, if anything, conservative. She declined. He said this was not a position that was sustainable for her, that the county's interest in the subsurface connection would not remain theoretical indefinitely, and that he had spoken to 2 members of the Water District Board who agreed with him that a formal access review was warranted. She looked at him across the table and said, "At the last assessment of my colony yield, you said 74 jars. The actual count was 81. She said it without emphasis, the way you state a fact that has no need of emphasis, because it is the kind of fact that states itself." He looked at her, and she watched him calculate what that meant, how she knew the figure he had used, what it said about his methods, and what it said about hers. He stood up, and he said the offer would not remain on the table indefinitely. She said she understood. He left. She wrote down the date and the figure and the discrepancy and put it in the folder with the attorney's letter and the hydrological survey, and she banked all of it, low, quiet, under ash. The community center meeting had been called by the Water District Board in response to a petition signed by 41 landholders in the valley, which was most of the operating farms, requesting an emergency session to address the aquifer crisis. Harlan Foss had been invited as a presenting stakeholder because Agricor held consolidated rights to enough of the valley's water to make him a material party to any regional solution. Vera had been invited because the hydrological survey was in the public record, and everyone in the valley now knew that the perched aquifer on the back 40 was the one water source in the region that was not in distress. She came with 43 jars of the fall extraction, late-season goldenrod and aster, a darker honey than the spring basswood, with a rougher sweetness to it, and she set them on the table as she would have set anything useful on a table, without ceremony. Brigida was in the 3rd row. Marcus was sitting beside his mother in the 5th row, in a chair that was slightly too large for him, with his hands folded in the manner of a person attending a proceeding of some importance. Gil Pruitt was near the back with his hat off. The board chairman opened the session and gave the floor first to Harlan Foss, who stood and addressed the room with the composed manner of a man who believes the ground under him is solid. He outlined Agricor's Watershed Partnership Initiative. He described the consolidated access model. He said that in a regional crisis, the efficient solution was centralized management by a qualified operator with the capital and expertise to maximize output, and that Agricor was prepared to offer the district a short-term contract for emergency supply management that would require, as a condition of the contract, first-right acquisition of any private water rights that could augment the regional supply, which would of course include the perched aquifer resource on the back 40 parcel currently held, he said, by a single owner of a limited B operation. He did not look at Vera when he said this. He said the compensation would be fair. He said the alternative, in his professional assessment, was continued individual distress with no coordinated relief. The room shifted in the way that rooms shift when an argument has been made that feels like a wall, inevitable and without a door. Vera stood up. She did not do it dramatically. She simply stood the way a person stands when it is her turn, and she is ready. She said she had one question for Mr. Foss before she spoke to the board. She said, "At our meeting on October 9th, you stated that my operation had produced 74 jars in its most recent extraction. I am asking you how you arrived at that figure." The room went very quiet. Harlan Foss looked at her and said he believed that was information from the county tax assessment. She said the county tax assessment did not assess jar counts, it assessed acreage and production value, and that the jar count he had stated at a private meeting on her property could only have come from a direct observation of her operation or from a third party he had engaged to observe it on his behalf, and that either of those constituted an unauthorized inspection of private property and a violation of her reasonable expectation of privacy, and that her attorney had been informed of this conversation and the figure that was used. The board chairman looked at Harlan Foss. Harlan Foss looked at the table. He said the figure had come from a community source. She said she understood. She said she wanted the board to understand it as well. Then she turned to the room, not to the table, and she said the following, and she said it in a voice that was not loud and did not need to be. She said, "I am not selling the water rights, not to Agricor, not to the district, not to anyone. What I am offering is a grazing and water access lease on the creek pasture through the winter, available to any operating farm in the valley for a cost of labor. The specific labor required is the repair and maintenance of infrastructure on the back 40 and the continued improvement of the creek bed access corridor. The lease is renewable in spring on the same terms. The creek has enough flow to support 6 operations at moderate head count through January without meaningful stress to the aquifer lens, and the hydrological survey, which is a public document and which I have printed copies of at this table, supports that assessment. She paused, and then she said, "The jars on the table are from the fall extraction. They are for anyone who would like to take one home. There is no charge." She sat down. The ceiling fan moved the heat from one corner of the room to another. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then Gil Pruitt, in the back row, said, "Thank you." And the sound of it, plain and undecorated, opened something in the room that had been held shut for a long while. The board chairman said he would like to table Mr. Foss's proposal pending review of the private inspection matter, which Foss's attorney would later determine was not worth pursuing given the exposure involved, and Foss sat for a further 10 minutes with his leather portfolio closed before him, and then stood and left without shaking hands. And his departure had the quality of a withdrawal rather than an exit, the kind that is noticed most by its lack of noise. People came to the table afterward and took jars, and several of them thanked Vera, and a few of them shook her hand, and some of them said they were sorry about how they had talked last December, and she accepted each of these things without making more of them than they were, because the accounting of those months was already settled, and did not require reopening. What mattered now was what came next. Brigida found her near the door afterward, and stood beside her for a moment and said, "You know what happens when you stop trying to run the bee." Vera said she knew. Brigida said, "Then you know what to do with the spring." And she went back across the field in her rubber boots to her linden trees in the last of the evening light. Marcus found Vera at her truck and asked if he could help expand the hive rows in the spring, because he had been reading about queen rearing and he thought deliberate had genetics worth propagating. She looked at him and said that was a serious idea and she would think about it seriously. He nodded and went to find his mother, and Vera drove home in the dark, the headlights finding the road one reach at a time, the way all roads are found. The rains came in the second week of November, not the dramatic deluge that drought endings sometimes produce in memory, but slowly, steadily. A week of gray skies and soft, persistent rain that sat on the ground and sank in without hurry. And the creek ran clear over its gravel bed for the first time since June. Vera stood at the edge of the bottomland on the 4th morning of rain and watched the water move and felt the ground soft under her boots, felt the give of it that had been absent through all those months of baked hardness. The cottonwood had dropped its last leaves, and the box elder stood bare, and the 40 acres lay open and quiet under the rain, breathing in what it had been waiting for. The hives were shut for the season, the entrances narrowed against drafts, the colonies deep in their winter clusters. She walked the row of boxes in the rain, touching each one lightly at the corner as she passed, not as an inspection, but as a kind of accounting, the way you run your hand across the spine of a book you have read and mean to read again. Deliberate was at the end of the row, as it had always been. She rested her palm on the top board and listened and heard the faint deep hum of the cluster, steady and untroubled and continuous. That is the whole of the arithmetic, she thought, the number that does not stop. When she turned back toward the farmhouse, the field looked different than it had when she arrived in November. Not because the field had changed, it was the same 40 acres it had always been, the same cottonwood and box elder and soft ground, the same marginal bottomland. Nobody had thought worth much, but because she had changed in the way that a person changes when they stop fighting a place and start learning it, which is also the way a person stops being a stranger. She walked back through the wet grass, and the rain came down, and the creek ran behind her, and somewhere in the middle distance she could hear the sound the valley made when it was getting what it needed, which was not a loud sound and not a remarkable one, just the sound of things continuing, which is, in the end, the only sound that matters. In the spring the basswood bloomed again.
pression avec le... avec l'autre fou, là. Ça va pas, hein. Comparé... Ouais, vous êtes des piliers de comptoir. Bah, bien sûr. Bien sûr, vous êtes des piliers. Alors, on essaie d'écouter un peu. Je sais pas trop ce qu'ils cherchent, en fait, à vrai dire. Oh, ils cherchent le sang de dragon. Donc elle, je sais pas trop, j'ai pas suivi. Quelqu'un peut me dire qui c'est en fait? Oh putain, la meuf a fait des streams, elle suit même pas l'histoire principale, c'est une catastrophe. Qui est cette dame par rapport à Mani? Fait chier ce truc là, pourquoi il est là?